8 bodies, 6 plastic barrels, one abandoned bank vault in a sleepy Australian town. For over a decade, neighbors smelled something rotting and said nothing. What police found inside those barrels rewrote Australia's definition of evil, and one detail from the crime scene still haunts investigators today. In the quiet farming town of Snowtown, South Australia, population barely 500, there stood an old branch of the state bank. It had closed years earlier. The vault inside was heavy, cold, and made of reinforced steel. On the 20th of May 1999, detectives from Adelaide drove 90 miles north, unlocked the vault, and stepped into a smell that seasoned officers would later describe as unlike anything they had ever encountered. Inside were 6 black plastic barrels, the kind used to store industrial acid, and inside those barrels were the partially dissolved remains of 8 human beings. This is the story of the Snowtown murders, also known as the bodies in the barrels case. It is, by body count and by cruelty, the worst serial killing spree in Australian history. 12 victims, 4 killers, a network of welfare fraud, sexual abuse, hatred, and manipulation stretching back more than 7 years. And at the center of it, a charismatic man named John Justin Bunting, who convinced ordinary suburban friends and family members to help him torture and murder people he decided did not deserve to live. To understand Snowtown, you have to understand the northern suburbs of Adelaide in the 1990s. Salisbury North, Elizabeth, Smithfield Plains, these were working-class suburbs built after the Second World War for factory workers and their families. By the 90s, the factories were closing. Unemployment was crushing. Housing Commission homes lined streets where nothing much happened. Into this landscape moved John Bunting, born in Queensland in 1966, a former slaughterhouse worker with a fascination for insects, guns, and what he considered moral cleansing. Bunting believed the world was infested with pedophiles and homosexuals, whom he lumped together and referred to using a single slur. He kept what he called a rockery in his backyard, a wall covered in the names of people he suspected. He would move names across the wall as he decided their fate. His first known victim was Clinton Trezise, a 22-year-old man, last seen in August 1992. Bunting, along with an accomplice, bludgeoned Trezise to death inside a house in Salisbury North and buried the body in a shallow grave in a paddock near Lower Light. The remains would be discovered by a farmer in August 1994. For years, the case sat cold. Police had a body they called Mr. Nobody. They had no name, no suspects, no motive. They had no idea they were looking at the opening chapter of a decade-long killing spree. Bunting's inner circle grew slowly. Robert Joe Wagner, a young man Bunting had taken under his wing, became his most loyal follower. Wagner had been abused as a child by an older man and carried that trauma into a burning, indiscriminate hatred. Then there was Mark Ray Hayden, a mechanic whose wife Elizabeth would become a victim. And finally, James Vlasakis, Bunting's stepson, a troubled teenager who would eventually testify and provide police with the roadmap through the entire nightmare. These 4 men, in various combinations, would carry out the killings between 1992 and 1999. The victims were not chosen at random. Almost every single one was known to the killers. Friends, neighbors, family members. Bunting selected people he had convinced himself were pedophiles, but the actual accusations were often based on nothing more than rumor, personal dislike, or the desire to steal a victim's Centrelink welfare payments. Because that was the second engine of the Snowtown murders. Money. Bunting and his crew would murder someone, then continue to collect that person's fortnightly government benefits for months or even years, forging signatures, mimicking voices on the phone, and telling relatives their loved one had simply moved interstate. In December 1995, Bunting killed Ray Davies, a 26-year-old intellectually disabled man who lived in a caravan behind the house of Bunting's partner. Davies was tortured, strangled, and buried in the backyard. His disability pension continued to flow into an account Bunting controlled. In November 1996, Suzanne Allen, a 47-year-old neighbor of Bunting, was found dead. Her body was cut into pieces and buried in the same backyard. Bunting continued to collect her pension for years. In 1997, Michael Gardner, a 19-year-old gay man who had once babysat Bunting's stepchildren, was strangled with a rope. His body was placed in the first of what would become the notorious barrels, because a body decomposes, and a body decomposing in a suburban Adelaide backyard becomes a problem. Bunting's solution was industrial. He acquired large black plastic barrels, the sort used to transport hydrochloric acid. He would place the bodies inside, cover them in dry acidic material, and seal them. When the smell became too strong at one property, they would move the barrels, from Bunting's Murray Bridge home to a storage shed, from the shed to a rented house, and finally, in early 1999, into the vault of the disused Snowtown bank, which Mark Hayden's brother had rented for a small fee. The murders themselves were not quick. This is where the Snowtown case moves from tragedy into something almost incomprehensible. Bunting believed in what he called making someone talk. Victims were often lured to a house under a false pretext, ambushed, and then tortured for hours. The killers used pliers, clamps, garrotes, and electric shock devices. They forced victims to record cassette tapes of themselves speaking, sometimes reading scripts, sometimes begging. These tapes would later be played over the phone to the victims' relatives to prove they were still alive. Some tapes were made to be replayed after death, so families would keep believing their loved one had simply run away. By 1998, the killings were accelerating. Gavin Porter, a friend of James Vlasakis, was murdered in April of that year. Troy Yude, Vlasakis' own half-brother, was killed inside the family home in August 1998, dragged from his bed at dawn, tortured in the bathroom, and strangled. Frederick Brooks, only 18 years old and the son of one of Bunting's ex-girlfriends, was killed in September. David Johnson, another of Vlasakis' stepbrothers, would become the final known victim in May 1999. He was murdered inside the very bank vault in Snowtown. Investigators later found evidence suggesting that after killing Johnson, the men cooked and tasted parts of his flesh. It is a detail that has been reported in court transcripts and that even hardened officers have refused to discuss publicly. Elizabeth Hayden, Mark Hayden's own wife, was murdered in November 1998 at her home in Smithfield Plains. She had reportedly grown suspicious of what her husband and Bunting were doing. Her disappearance became the loose thread that finally unraveled everything. Her brother, Garion Sinclair, refused to accept the story that Elizabeth had simply run off. He went to the South Australia police. He filed reports. He kept calling. He kept pushing. And unlike so many missing persons cases involving marginalized people in the northern suburbs, this one attracted attention. Detectives began surveilling Bunting, Wagner, Hayden, and Vlasakis. They noticed the men moving barrels between properties. They followed a rented truck from a house in Murray Bridge north through the wheat belt, watching it pull up outside a squat, cream-colored building on Railway Terrace in Snowtown. That building was the old bank. On the 20th of May 1999, armed with a search warrant, officers entered the vault. What they found redefined Australian criminal history. 11 separate bodies were eventually accounted for, 8 inside the barrels, some cut into pieces, along with tools that told the story of what had been done to them. Rubber gloves, rope, a drill, latex gloves, knives, and most disturbing of all, hooks and metal implements consistent with prolonged torture. The investigation, codenamed Operation Chart, was one of the largest and most expensive in South Australian history. Detectives spent months identifying the victims through dental records, DNA, and personal effects. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses across 3 states. They dug up backyards. They excavated paddocks. The trial that followed would run for nearly 12 months, the longest in Australian legal history at the time, and would cost taxpayers more than $15 million. James Vlasakis broke first. Facing overwhelming evidence and, according to his own account, unable to live with what he had done to his own family members, he pleaded guilty to 4 murders and turned state's witness. His testimony was devastating. He described how Bunting had groomed him from adolescence, using a mixture of praise, threats, and shared hatred to bind him into the group. He described specific killings in horrifying detail. He described the tape recordings. He described the way Bunting laughed. Vlasakis was sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 26 years. John Bunting and Robert Wagner faced trial together in 2003. The jury heard 250 witnesses. They listened to the tape recordings. They viewed photographs so graphic that the courtroom had to be closed at times. Both men were convicted of multiple counts of murder. Bunting was found guilty of 11 murders. Wagner was found guilty of 10, after having already pleaded guilty to 3 earlier. Both received life sentences with no possibility of parole. The judge stated that both men should never be released from prison, ever, under any circumstances. Mark Hayden was tried separately. Prosecutors could not prove he personally killed anyone. He was, however, convicted of assisting in 5 murders, primarily by helping conceal and transport the barrels. He was sentenced to 25 years. Hayden was released in 2024 under strict supervision conditions, a decision that provoked significant public anger in South Australia and prompted the government to pass emergency legislation restricting where he could live. What makes Snowtown so uniquely disturbing, beyond the sheer body count, is how ordinary the killers looked. Bunting was known to his neighbors as friendly, funny, someone who would help you fix your car or babysit your kids. Wagner was quiet. Hayden was unremarkable. They lived in the same suburb as their victims. They shared meals with them. Some of them slept in the same beds as the family members they would go on to murder. The Snowtown killings were not the work of a stranger in the shadows. They were the product of a domestic ecosystem, a subculture of hatred and welfare fraud hidden inside a housing trust street, where everyone knew each other and no one asked the right questions. The official inquiries that followed asked hard questions of the welfare system. How had the Australian government continued paying pensions to 11 dead people for years? How had banks not flagged the withdrawals? How had missing persons reports for multiple victims gone essentially uninvestigated for so long? Reforms followed, but the sense remained, and remains today, that the victims of Snowtown were people the system had already partly forgotten before they died. Poor, disabled, gay, estranged from family, living on the margins, Bunting hunted at the edges of society precisely because he understood that the edges were where no one was looking. And there is one detail that continues to haunt investigators. Among the possessions found inside the vault was a list, written in Bunting's own handwriting. Names. Some crossed out, some not. Names of people who were still alive at the time of the arrests. People who had no idea they were being considered. Police contacted every one of them. Most were shocked. Some were skeptical. All of them, in one form or another, had known Bunting personally. To this day, no one knows exactly how far his plans reached, or how many more barrels might have joined the 8 in the bank vault if a brother-in-law had not refused to stop asking questions. The town of Snowtown itself has struggled with the association ever since. Residents point out, correctly, that none of the murders actually happened inside the town. The killings took place in Adelaide and Murray Bridge. Snowtown was only the storage site, chosen for its cheap rent and its distance from prying eyes. Yet the name has stuck. The bank building still stands on Railway Terrace. For years, curious tourists would drive up to photograph it. A 2011 feature film, simply titled Snowtown, brought the story to international audiences and cemented the town's dark reputation in global true crime folklore. What remains decades later are the victims: Clinton Trezise, Ray Davies, Suzanne Allen, Michael Gardner, Barry Lane, Thomas Trevelyan, Gavin Porter, Troy Yude, Frederick Brooks, Gary O'Dwyer, Elizabeth Hayden, David Johnson. 12 people, most of them young, most of them poor, most of them targeted precisely because Bunting believed the world would not notice they were gone. He was wrong about a great many things. That was one of them. If this case shook you the way it shook Australia, subscribe to Dark Cases. Every week we open another file the world tried to forget. Hit the bell, because the next case we're covering has a twist that even the detectives who solved it still cannot fully explain.